They pushed me across the table like I was a stray napkin. Not metaphorically, literally. Brittany's elbow caught my wrist, my plate rocked, gravy sloshed, and there I was, chin over china, while 23 relatives looked at their silverware as if nothing had happened. The room smelled like pine and aftershave, and the kind of cleaned wood polish that hides fingerprints. My uncle, the man who'd taken me in when I was 13 and promised everything, laughed like it was a joke. My mother clapped politely and pretended not to see the sauce on my sleeve. No one helped me up. You can remember a shove for years. It lodges somewhere quieter than the bruise, deeper than the embarrassment, right where your dignity used to sit. That shove is how this whole thing started, how I learned the texture of other people's loyalties, and how a legal freeze, 15 years later, ended up being the only solid thing left between me and complete erasure. If you like these kinds of true life stories, hit subscribe. I tell them because somebody needs to know how this actually looks. To understand why that shove mattered, you need to go back to the winter my parents left. When I was 13, my parents walked out of our house and didn't come back. There wasn't a dramatic diary-worthy scene, no slammed door or suitcase at dawn. One morning they kissed me and said they were going away for a while, then weeks melted into months. The phone calls were fewer, the checks stopped, and my world compressed to the size of a school locker and a single cardboard box of things I'd shoved under my bed. My uncle, Christopher Hale, showed up with a car big enough to drown in and a smile that smelled like leather and bay rum. He insisted that he'd always been family and that he would take care of me. Legally, he became my guardian. In practice, he became the heir in the house. We moved into his townhouse on a tree-lined street that smelled expensive. My room had a view of something green and real. I started at a private school, got a proper winter coat. A winter coat that cost more than the tuition at my middle school had for a year. People called it luck. I called it survival. In those first years, gratitude and guilt braided together until I couldn't tell which was which. He bought me things I didn't know how to receive without paying for them in obedience. He set rules, curfews, manners, which relatives were appropriate to visit, and rewarded compliance with privileges. His daughter, Brittany, tall, glossy, given everything with a tremor of entitlement, was the sun. I was the planet that rotated because the sun allowed it. She got the car for prom. I took the bus. She got the internship at her father's company. I got a scholarship that never had to be spent because the so-called education fund was apparently redirected into some holding accounts that never translated into 1098s or college bills. I learned how to say thank you like a practice script. I became fluent in smiling when I was furious. I learned the architecture of favors. At the time, I thought that was what family looked like. A hierarchy of love, measured in favors and flight upgrades, and the portion of the estate someone remembered to leave you. I also learned to notice numbers. Not in a way that felt romantic at the time. There was nothing glamorous about long nights reading quarterly reports on the kitchen table. But I started to notice patterns. At an early age, I learned how the small details of accounting expose the large lies of behavior. A transfer with no memo, a recurring vendor that didn't exist, an expense line labeled home maintenance that always appeared around the time someone bought a new watch. I didn't plan to be a forensic person. I studied compliance because I wanted a job where rules mattered and where exceptions had to be justified in writing. It turned out that compliance is a magnifying glass you can use on people you used to love. Those early suspicions were little things. A check for college that bounced against an overdraft because the account it was supposed to be in had been shifted into a corporate LLC. A deed signed in a rushed script that reassigned a rental property to Hale Family Holdings. Brittany's summer internship that listed payments as honoraria that matched the number in an old line item marked Educational Trust. On their own, any one of those details could be explained. A mistake, a bookkeeping category, an administrative oversight. Together, over years, they formed the geometry of a plan. But you don't accuse the man whose hand put food in your mouth without evidence. You don't tell the woman who signed the permission slips and packed your lunch that she spent your scholarship. Not unless you can show her a paper trail that says so, clearly and relentlessly. So I did the only thing I had left that felt like agency. I started documenting. Documentation is not dramatic. It is tedious, and it tightens a rope slowly. Not in a cinematic montage, but in the slow accumulation of receipts and dates. I created folders, literal manila ones at first, then encrypted folders on drives. I saved PDFs of property transfers, copies of emails that mentioned reallocating funds, text messages that suggested a reorganization of family assets. I learned how to export bank statements without altering anything, how to label things so they could be found later. To me, it was protection. To others, it would look like paranoia. There were social costs. You can only be the obedient niece for so long before the obligation turns into expectation. The household economy shifted toward Brittany. New suits, a renovated home office, a college fund that expanded for her cousins but did not exist on paper for me. I continued to say thank you. I learned which phrases smoothed the air. But when the gaps kept widening and the explanations stopped satisfying even my thrift-driven sense of fairness, the anger hardened into a practical question. How do you stop someone who has the legal keys from melting the house around your name? I wish the answer had been simpler. It wasn't. The escalation, which looks from the outside like a slow and steady campaign, began in the margins. An extra deed here, a new LLC there, a real estate contract that rotated for shell companies until nobody could tell who the real owner was without a title search and a magnifying glass. Once I recognized the pattern, I started to map it, because patterns let you predict behavior. I began to notice the timing. Transfers often happened after holidays, right after a compliment about family loyalty. The same law firm's name appeared when assets needed to be reclassified. If you saw the same signature on a deed as on a power of attorney, and there wasn't a recorded reason, that's not bookkeeping, it's redirection. I tried to ask questions. What happened to my education fund? I asked my mother once, in a tone that tried to be casual, the way you try to keep a thermometer level in a room that's heating up. She smiled the way someone who's been taught to smile when in pain smiles, small, distant, rehearsed. Christopher handles the money, she said. The phrase was both shield and bludgeon. I remember the click of her teaspoon against the cup, the little rattle that someone else in that house had learned to ignore. The real break came on a night that began like any other holiday. We had the family together, cooked turkey under a cloud of cinnamon, the television murmuring some trivial game, the candles smelling faintly of orange. Uncle Christopher gave a toast that everyone had to pretend they loved. Brittany wore a dress that matched the centerpiece. My mother folded napkins into little boats. The table smelled like rosemary and something sharp beneath the lemon. Halfway through dessert, when the adult conversation had settled into a comfortable drone about yachts and corporate merges, Grandma Etta, who had always been more of a quiet observer than a participant, slid a USB stick across to me under the tablecloth. Her hand was tremulous, like an old tree limb in wind. Her voice was small. "If you ever need it," she said, "don't be afraid." There are 1,000 ways for a moment like that to be misunderstood. It could have been a note about a recipe or a misplaced school photo. But Grandma Etta had always been the kind of woman who knit details into meaning. She kept ledgers in a closet. She knew the names of the men the family hired to change the locks. She remembered signatures. When she pushed that stick into my palm, she pushed a lifeline. Later that night, when the kitchen emptied and the dishes waited like small white graves in the sink, I sat on the counter and plugged in the drive. I am explicitly not going to describe any technique that would qualify as hacking or invasion of privacy. The drive was given to me. The files were there. That distinction matters. There's a moral line between finding what's been offered and stealing what isn't yours, and I wanted to stand on the right side of it. What I found wasn't cinematic. No incriminating video of Christopher rubbing his hands together, no audio confession. It was paper, which is stranger and colder. Scanned wills, unsigned drafts, copies of emails redirecting funds, account statements that had been rerouted through a maze of little companies with names like Hale Legacy LLC and North Shore Holdings. There were 2 wills, one that named me and a very clear chain of custody that suggested it had been signed years before, and another that surfaced as an unsigned draft with annotations that made it look like someone had been preparing a new version to cut me out. The documents were a map that explained why my FAFSA forms had been ignored, why the trust fund line item kept changing descriptions, why D-transfers happened in dead-of-night closings, where a notary's blotter could be scraped for the history of a signature. There was a series of bank transfers that moved small amounts into corporate accounts with names that matched the attorneys from the deeds. Some of the transactions were listed as loan disbursements, others as consulting fees, both vague enough to hide the true beneficiary. There was also a photograph, grainy, taken with a phone. I can't prove whether it was staged or candid, but it showed Christopher signing a document at his study desk while Brittany stood nearby with her hands on the back of his chair. The photograph had a timestamp embedded, March 12th, 2009. That was the year after they left. I felt my stomach go cold. You learn to measure betrayal in timestamps. The first thing I did was copy everything. Not because I thought I'd be clever enough to bury a copy in some safe place nobody could reach, but because copies are necessary for credibility. Originals can be questioned, duplicates are evidence of consistency. I labeled folders by date, by subject, by the emotion I felt at the moment I saw it. Practical and petty in one breath. I wrote a 1-paragraph description of each file, timestamped to the minute, and noted the chain of who had access to what. I also did something I hadn't planned on. I called Jennifer. Jennifer was my cousin and a paralegal at a small firm that handled estates. She was not the kind of person who believed in accidental discovery. She believed in process. When I told her what I found, she asked for nothing emotional. She wanted a list and a copy of every file. "If you have this," she said quietly, "we can make it speak." Her first suggestion was what any sane paralegal would suggest. Get a backup, establish a chain of custody, and do not distribute anything until you have a plan. She told me stories about paperwork being dismissed because it was presented with emotion rather than organization. "Organize," she said. "Make them have to read it. Make them see the pattern." That felt like armor. I set up a secure folder and exported copies. I created an index spreadsheet that would look boring to anyone who wasn't trying to hide something. Document type, date, source, observed discrepancy, notes. It's the thing you do when you want to be taken seriously by a stranger in a courtroom, or by a prosecutor, or a bank compliance officer. Boring trumps righteous. Proof beats fury. Then I did the most difficult moral balancing act of all. I had to decide whether to go public. There's a seductive logic to public exposure. If the story lives online, then it is harder for someone to bury it in a file drawer. Social media is a blunt instrument. You can use it to create pressure. It also cuts both ways. I knew the risk of a smear campaign. I knew the way powerful people could hire lawyers to paint you as an ungrateful opportunist rather than a wronged ward. I also knew that legal channels can be slow and sometimes inattentive when the accused has cash and counsel. I weighed proximity to risk against the need to stop further depletion. I thought about creditors, people who might be about to get scammed by transfers if they didn't know the ownership had been changed. I thought about the charitable arms of the family business, which, if misdirected, would leave actual programs without funding. I thought about Brittany, who had been told from the crib that family was loyalty. I thought about my grandmother, who had enough to live on, but not enough to fight in a courtroom. Finally, I wrote a plan. It's boring to list steps, but that's how you build a fort. First, create secure, time-stamped copies of every document and store them in at least 3 places, 1 physical, 2 encrypted online repositories. Second, get corroboration. If a document appears to be a forgery, find the original signatory, or at least the notary, or a retained lawyer who could verify the signature. Third, identify immediate financial threats, pending transfers, wire dates, checks that could clear, and alert the relevant institutions. Fourth, contact an attorney experienced in fiduciary disputes and trusts, someone who could place temporary holds if there was imminent danger. Fifth, assemble a small coalition of witnesses, including my grandmother and Jennifer, so any story I told could be presented with corroboration. I wrote it in a single, unnerving night while my hands shook and the house hummed like a foreign body. I practiced how I would say things in a legal letter. No emotional flourishes, just facts and requests. Please freeze account X until documentation is reviewed. Please confirm receipt. I traced each transaction back to its source institution and made a cold list. Bank name, account number, routing, date. Numbers do not plead. Numbers force an institution to act or to send you a form letter. There were ethical fences I refused to cross. I would not lie. I would not pretend to be someone I was not. I would not access accounts that were not offered to me. Grandma Etta had given me the drive, and I intended to use it as evidence, not as a tool of vengeance. Before I hired anyone, I made a call to a compliance hotline at a mid-sized bank, anonymously at first, to ask how they handled suspicious transfers tied to trusts. The analyst on the other end was patient and precise. "You can file a suspicious activity report," she said. "We can review, but we'll need documentation. An account freeze is a legal action and usually requires a court order or a direct action from a trustee or a legal hold from a prosecutor." She explained in plain language the difference between administrative holds and emergency freezes. That was useful. The difference between a bank pausing a transfer and the government stepping in is not just semantics, it's a gulf of resources and legal teeth. Still, I needed more than a bank analyst. I needed a lawyer who would not be cowed by Christopher's name or by his retainer. I needed someone who would read my spreadsheet and not see a resentful niece, but a pattern of conduct. I called an attorney I had found by reputation, Mitchell Reeves. I had a half-remembered business card from the time when Mitchell handled an old family will for my great-aunt. He answered the phone after a blink of silence that felt like the waiting room before a hearing. When I said my name and started to explain, carefully, legally, he didn't cut me off. He asked a few direct questions. He told me to send the copies and to label them exactly as I had labeled them. Organization, he said, which in legal people is the same as prayer. By the time I had Mitchell on the phone, I had a stack of things I could point to. The 2 wills, the mapped transfers, the deed abnormalities, receipts that bridged the corporate entities. I emailed him the folder with a short professional note. "I have reason to believe that assets intended for me have been reallocated. I am providing these documents for review. Please advise on immediate actions to protect my interest." He replied within 24 hours with a templated-looking email that contained exactly what I needed to hear and nothing I wanted to hear. He could bring a court action, but it might take months. There were emergency motions that could be filed,
but for an emergency freeze, you typically need a demonstrable imminent risk, like a scheduled wire that would evaporate funds before a court hearing could occur. He suggested a preemptive step: place a hold via the bank and notify the trustees and the companies involved of a potential dispute. He also cautioned me, going public with counsel could complicate the legal strategy. What I did next felt, at the time, like walking on a cliff, but under the limit of the law.
I gave Mitchell copies. I shared the spreadsheet with Jennifer, and I made sure Grandma Etta had a signed witness statement confirming she had handed me the drive and that the files were her recollection of things she'd seen over the years. I printed a paper trail in a binder that looked plainer than it was dangerous. White sheets in a black binder, annotated with post-it notes, stapled receipts, the grainy photograph with the timestamp inked beneath it. There is a peculiar kind of fear that comes when you move from suspicion to action. You are no longer passively wronged. You are an actor. That comes with consequences. I slept in fits the first week after I compiled the binder. Every sound made me think someone was at the door. When my phone rang, my chest clenched. You learn to measure your world by the rhythm of returns. Emails, phone calls, the click of the mailbox. I remember the exact moment I decided to act. It was 3:12 a.m. in my tiny office that used to be a linen closet when I was a kid. The house was a hush. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen like the drumbeat of something big. I had all the documents laid out and a list of institutions that needed to know. If you're thinking about the cinematic choice, middle of the night, dramatic keys, you're not far off. There is a kind of moral clarity in the small hours. The choice is stripped of the daytime illusions and gives you a question in black and white. If you do nothing, they will continue. If you act, the consequences are unknown. I composed a single email, and then another, each better than a rage-filled post and worse than silence. One went to Mitchell, blunt and pragmatic. Please file the motion on my behalf to seek an emergency restraining order on asset transfers until forensic review can be completed. Attachments, binder index, key documents, urgent flagged. The other was to a compliance officer at one of the banks, holding the largest of the transferred assets. Notification of potential irregularities. Please review account numbers X and Y and advise whether administrative holds are possible pending legal notice. I double-checked the attachments, verified the timestamps, and then, with hands that were steadier than my heart, I pressed send. There was no cinematic drumroll. The send button is quiet. The world did not change in an audible way. What happened instead was paperwork entering the legal circulation. Emails, receipts, a read receipt on Mitchell's reply that said in small letters, delivered. I sat in the countertop light and watched the edges of the binder, like they might have teeth. Waiting was strange. Waiting is an act that demands patience and prepares you for the fact that justice, even when you do everything by the book, takes time. And yet, even as I thought I had moved into a controlled phase, I knew the danger had only begun. The man who had the most to lose, Christopher Hale, owned an entire apparatus built to move money and narratives, lawyers. Public relations. Goodwill that functions like a debt. He could make me a story that sounded absurd. He could make me a child who misunderstood generosity. He had chaptered years of his life into the image of family benefactor, a phrase you cannot easily unglue from a society that tends to reward polished hands. So I did the careful, boring thing that unfamiliar storytellers sometimes miss in the drama. I rehearsed my answers to being disbelieved. I documented the sources of my evidence. I made sure that in every place where emotion could be used against me, there was a stricter, purer fact. A file, a timestamp, a bank transaction that matched a receipt. I printed a statement from Grandma Etta, signed in ink. I had Jennifer sign an affidavit stating she had seen the documents and believed them to be authentic. The aim was to not only be right, but to be credible. 2 days later, at 9:04 a.m., I received an automatic reply from one of the banks. Thank you for contacting us. We will review your submission and respond within 10 business days. It was a bureaucratic sentence that felt both like protection and a kick in the teeth. 10 business days is a universe when someone is moving assets. 10 business days is a long time. I did not have to wait 10 days before I realized something else. The family, my mother, the relatives who had watched the gravy splash, had their own rhythms of panic and defense. In the quiet that followed sending the emails, I found myself watching how people shifted in small ways. A new vector of polite distance from my mother. Texts I ignored that tried to be casual. Brittany's social accounts suddenly full of carefully curated family photos. It felt like the first outward ripple of a stone thrown into water, calm on the surface and underneath, invisible currents moving. I also learned something about the ethics of telling people your story.
When you start to name names, people take sides. Some choose the side that gives them comfort. Others choose the side that keeps them safe. A few people slide into the small space of courage because they're tired of being complicit. The night I pressed send, I also posted nothing. I did not go to social media. I had heard the stories of people who broadcasted, only to be accused of trying to profit from their pain. I did not need that. I needed institutions. And institutions move on paperwork and precedent, not on viral outrage. I learned to love the sterile language of a filing form the way other people love a center of faith. That phase, the one where you think organization will protect you, ended with a single, ordinary sound, the chime of my phone. It was a text from an unknown number that read, "Be careful what you do next." Then a voicemail from someone who said he was a family friend and that things could get ugly. Then, from my mother, a photo of the dinner table with a heart emoji and the words, "Family first." That was the moment the map revealed its thin places.
The people who loved me were also the people who had learned to live inside the behavior that had built a life for them. They had, in subtle ways, been made comfortable by Christopher's largesse, and the idea of losing that comfort, of having their sense of security disrupted by court battles and questions, was frightening to them in a way that did not always align with whether I had been robbed. Even with a binder and a lawyer and a plan, I was still, in the eyes of those who preferred the story of a benefactor rather than the story of a manipulator, the one who would always be the ingrate. But I had a different kind of ally who did not speak much and who had been carrying a different weight, Grandma Etta. She began to tell small, oblique stories at family gatherings, stories about signatures on deeds, about a man who once tried to change a lock in the middle of the night, about a notary who didn't look quite right. In a room that had rehearsed loyalty, her memory was an inconvenient thing. She kept saying in that thin voice that breaks hearts and cements wuzzles, "I remember." Her memory is what made me brave enough to move from an email to action. Memory creates witnesses. Witnesses create the possibility of accountability. So that is where the first part of this story pauses, not because the danger was over, but because the line between preparation and confrontation had been crossed. I had files and witnesses, a paralegal cousin who could make paperwork recite a sermon of facts, and an attorney who knew how to turn an index into a motion. I had told no one on social media and had contacted institutions who could, in theory, act under their own rules. What I did not yet have was the reaction from the most powerful person in the room, the man who had the disposable cash, the lawyers, the ability to spin a narrative. I did not yet know whether he would choose the quiet path, discreet settlements and transfers behind closed doors, or the loud path, PR teams, lawsuits, and accusations meant to turn public opinion into a shield. At 2:18 a.m., 2 nights after I hit send, I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about the shove. It felt different now. It wasn't merely humiliation, it was notice. An ignition. The shove had disrupted the equation. If you humiliate me in public and expect me to remain grateful, you misunderstand the way evidence accumulates. I understood that my gratitude had been purchased. I wanted to know what it bought. I slept with the binder on the floor beside the bed. When a police car went by, I started. When the phone buzzed with an unknown number, I flinched. Waiting is a weapon that a determined person uses against you. You have to learn to steady your hands. You have to learn to make routines that aren't fear. But you also have to be ready for the fact that the first knock on the door might be someone who wants to help, or it might be someone who wants to test your courage. What I didn't know, and what you don't know yet, is how he would move. Men with money have options that are legal, and a few that hover in the gray. They have lawyers who can make threats that look like paperwork. They can file suit to silence you, or they can buy the narrative so thoroughly that your account looks like sour grapes. They can do none of those things and simply continue, letting time erode your proof into forgetfulness. So I waited. I organized. I built a chain of evidence. I listened for clicks in the night. I told myself that preparedness was a moral act, not revenge, but preservation. If you have been robbed of a childhood, the smallest acts of documentation feel like reclaiming a map that should have been yours. That is the point where I stop for now, with documents in a folder, an attorney on standby, a grandmother who remembers, and a man with the power to change the story in his favor. The next part is when the apparatus of defense begins to flex. The PR calls, the legal letters, the social media pitches that try to recast a narrative. The next part is when the first counterpunch lands, and we test whether careful paperwork is enough to hold a family accountable. The first legal letter arrived like a polite warning wrapped in threat, a 2-page demand from Richard Steinberg, Christopher's go-to counsel, accusing me of defamation and threatening litigation if I didn't cease and desist. It was formal, precise, the kind of thing that smells faintly of lacquer and confidence. The envelope felt heavier than the pages inside. They didn't send a van of men to my door, they hired a machine. Within 48 hours, the machine produced a public relations memo drafted by Doug, an op-ed-ready narrative that would be fed to local reporters.
It painted me as the estranged ward with a grievance, accused me of attempting to leverage family drama for personal gain, and called my documents an unverified collection of grievances. There were implied questions about my motives, and a carefully placed phrase about unfortunate family disputes played out publicly. It was precise. It was toxic. It was everything a well-funded family narrative machine should look like when it wants to bury a person. The first punch hit where I was most vulnerable, at work. A partner at the compliance consultancy where I had spent years building a reputation called me into a meeting and said neutral things about risk and reputational exposure. HR put me on administrative leave pending an internal review. They called it standard procedure. It felt like being placed in a soundproof box while people with more power than sense debated whether it was safer to believe the suit with the retainer or the woman with the binder. It is a strange, slow violence when institutions decide your truth is a liability.
The same networks and protocols that allow corporations to move funds precisely also move narratives. An emailed op-ed here, a strategic leak to a reporter there, a sympathetic interview with Christopher's charity director explaining how generosity can be misunderstood. I watched my name being made into a story that was not mine, and for the first time, the prospect that the system might not be inclined to believe me felt dangerously real. But the PR attacks had a weakness in them. They were performative. They needed breath, and breath comes from the media and from other people repeating the story. If you could slow the oxygen, provide context, offer corroboration, force documents into institutions that could act, you could starve the narrative of oxygen. Which is what we tried to do. Mitchell filed emergency motions that week. He asked the court for preservation orders, legal steps requiring that no one destroy documents, that certain accounts be placed on temporary holds, and that the parties maintain whatever the status quo was until a forensic audit could be performed. In plain terms, he asked a judge to tell Christopher, his companies, and their law firm to stop touching anything that might be evidence. He filed under the statute that governs fiduciary duty and trust disputes, and he asked for a temporary restraining order on recent transfers. A temporary restraining order isn't a slam dunk. Courts require evidence of imminent risk, like a scheduled wire or sale. That's why your paperwork needs to do more than feel convincing. It needs to show the machine in motion. Jennifer helped us pull transaction logs and title searches that suggested immediate movement. She flagged a closing scheduled for 3 days out on a parcel that had, on its face, been part of my grandmother's estate. That sort of timing converted a filing from a petition to an emergency request. Our motion got a hearing date faster than I expected. I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with a manila folder that had been my weapon for months and felt absurdly small amid the swirl of legal paper and shoulder-padded jackets. I remember the fluorescent light, the smell of dry polish, and a clerk who looked like she'd seen too many family betrayals to be surprised. When we stood before the judge, Mitchell did something I respected. He did not inflame. He presented a timeline, a table of transfers, a list of witnesses, and a request framed as remedy rather than rhetorical victory. The court granted a preservation order that first day. Stop touching documents, preserve all communications, and do not transfer the property in question until a further hearing. It was not a final victory. It was a pause. For the first time since I hit send on those emails at 3:12 a.m., there was an official ledger entry that said hold. The legal system had chosen to hold its breath and consider. Christopher's team responded in the only way they could, loudly and through other mouths. They began to leak curated elements of their archive to reporters, image-heavy pieces about the family charity, glowing testimonials about Christopher's contributions to the community, and hints that I was trying to tear the family apart. Brittany made a short interview appearance in which she spoke of being hurt by these allegations, and the local news trimmed that into an anchor-friendly chunk about family discord. Social media accelerated the crash. A short clip of Brittany at a charity gala, posted by Christopher's PR team, gained traction. People who had never met me were invested. The comments pages did what comments pages do. They produced a mob with the speed of a single keystroke. Some messages were cruel, some were sympathetic, most were inattentive to nuance. It would have been easy to panic. Instead, we leaned harder into law and documentation. Statements began to converge. I had Grandma Etta's notarized account. Jennifer could testify about the documents. Dorothy, a paralegal who had recently left Christopher's legal team, reached out with something we had not counted on, a recording. Dorothy had been a junior paralegal at Steinberg & Associates. She had, she said, been troubled for months by meetings that seemed less about legal counsel and more about message placement. One night, after she'd put in an extra-long hour cataloging client files, she recorded a portion of a phone call between one of Christopher's senior advisors and a consultant. The recording, which Dorothy made available to us through Mitchell, contained strategy talk about controlling the public narrative, about timing litigation to keep matters private, and about coordinating with media contacts. It was not by itself evidence of wrongdoing, but it undermined the immaculate image the PR pieces tried to show. Careful, rehearsed strategy overlaid the spontaneity of family grief. We embedded Dorothy's recording into our legal submissions, not to convict in the court of public opinion, but to show intent,
to show that Dim was an apparatus prepared to manipulate perception rather than address the facts. That matters in fiduciary disputes, because motive can color conduct. If you intentionally obscure transfers to hide beneficiaries, that matters to a judge. Then something else happened that changed the course of this whole thing, something I had suspected but had no way to prove without an institutional actor, a federal inquiry. It started as a quiet conversation, an email from Mitchell advising caution, a phone call from an unknown number that asked whether I would be willing to speak to investigators. I said yes. You sign the consent forms, and the memory of the binder shifts from personal defense into a tool for public prosecution. It was Agent Sarah Chen who walked into a small conference room at Mitchell's office with a stack of subpoenas and a tired professional calm.
Agent Chen introduced herself as an investigator with a federal agency handling financial crimes. She did not theatrically lean across the table and say she was there to save me. She said, plain efficient, that our matter had been flagged due to repeated transfers between personal and corporate accounts, the use of LLCs for what looked like personal enrichment, and patterns that might qualify for federal investigation because they crossed state lines and potentially involved banks that reported transactions to federal regulators. I had a moment of dizzy disbelief. Federal involvement was what you read about in documentaries, not something you slept under the same roof as. But the logic of it was simple. When money moves across many channels and serves to conceal beneficiaries, federal statutes on wire fraud, money laundering, and other financial crimes can apply. If so, your local preservation order is suddenly backed by agencies with subpoenas, forensic accountants, and the power to request emergency asset restraining orders. Agent Chen was meticulous. She interviewed me in a room that smelled of coffee and paper. She asked for originals or certified copies of documents. She asked if anyone had threatened me. She asked if I had reached out to media. She asked if she'd heard of certain shell companies that matched the names in my folders. I answered in the language I had learned. Dates, transactions, chain of custody, while feeling the strange simultaneous relief and dread of being pulled into the machinery of the state. An emergency asset restraining order arrived like a thunderclap. Courts granted federal agents the authority to freeze accounts linked to an ongoing investigation. That didn't mean assets would be permanently seized. It meant no one could touch them while investigators dug. That included certain accounts held in my parents' names that were connected to the same web of transfers. When the bank messenger called to say several accounts had been put on hold pending federal inquiry, I felt a cold mix of vindication and guilt. There is a sharp ethical edge to having someone's access to money stopped, even if your evidence suggests that money was being steered away from its intended owners. Christopher, unsurprisingly, answered with motion and noise. He filed counterclaims. He hired a different set of lawyers who used a mixture of legal motions, public statements, and private requests to try and unfreeze what he could. He sent letters to charity boards asking for audits of my claim. He used his influence in the community to make the story look like an unfortunate but private dispute. He even filed a preemptive suit asking the court to declare certain documents inadmissible as a matter of privilege. But the financial engines are slow, and federal investigations are deliberate. As prosecutors and agents worked, subpoenas began to pull at the loose threads. Bank records were produced under court order. Forensic accountants traced funds across accounts, and their reports started to show patterns. Payments characterized as consulting that corresponded to the purchase of a watch. Transfers labeled loan that cycled back into the same family holdings. Payments to companies that existed only on paper. The forensic reports are not dramatic reading, but they are precise. They show the math of how a fortune can be allocated without leaving an obvious public ledger. Meanwhile, the public narrative continued to be messy. Christopher's allies pushed videos of him in front of soup kitchens and boardrooms, while my inbox filled with anonymous threats and a few messages of unexpected kindness. A small group of former employees from Christopher's firm reached out with anonymous tips. A woman who had worked as an executive assistant produced expense receipts that matched dates of transfers we were questioning. People who had been made comfortable by Christopher's largesse were suddenly faced with the reality that some of that comfort had been produced by redirection. That moral discomfort produced courage in a few places. One of the more surreal turns was the role social media ended up playing in my favor. Chad, an independent documentarian who had once done a short piece about philanthropic families in our state, reached out and asked if he could interview me. Not for clicks, he insisted, but to document a pattern he'd seen before. The cosmetically charitable family whose internal accounting told a different story. We were careful with what we released. Mitchell warned against releasing anything that would interfere with the investigation. But Chad's approach was to tell a human story around the forensic facts. He intercut clips of Grandma Etta speaking quietly about signatures with shots of bank ledgers. He let Jennifer explain in plain terms what a forged or redirecting transfer looks like. The documentary didn't indict, it asked questions. But questions, when coupled with subpoenas and forensic reports, are dangerous in a court of public favor. And then one morning, a headline that had my name in it as a footnote read, "Local businessman arrested in probe of estate transfers." Christopher's name in the subhead. Arrests occurred after indictments were filed. Agents executed search warrants at properties and at law offices. Christopher was brought into custody.
He posted bond in one jurisdiction and was held in another for questioning. The spectacle was less cinematic than I expected, no dramatic handcuffs on a courthouse step, but the legal machinery had engaged. When federal prosecutors requested emergency asset freezes on accounts connected to Christopher and certain family entities, Banks complied. That included the accounts held in my parents' names that had been routed through his network.
15 years after they stepped out of our lives, those accounts were suddenly and legally frozen as part of an inquiry into the movement of funds that may have affected them. The headline writers used the word freeze like it was an arrow hitting center. That word, freeze, will live with me the way the shove does. It is a public action given legal teeth. No withdrawals, no transfers, no access pending a court's further ruling. For some family members, it felt like salvation. For others, such as my mother, it felt like punishment. I received a call from her amidst the flurry of subpoenas, saying simply, "They've frozen everything." There was relief in her voice and fear. The nuance was that being frozen by a court is not the same as being guilty. It is a protective measure while a court sorts fact from fiction. I tried to explain that to her in patient, legal language, how evidence has to be gathered, how restraint orders are procedural, not moral, but legal language has edges of its own and does not always console. The low point for me was not the arrests or the freezing of accounts. It was watching people I loved feel fearful and betrayed. My mother, who had stayed in the house that Christopher's kindness had warmed, called late one night in tears. I had not wanted this for her. I had wanted clarity, not to see her life frozen by an investigation that implicated the man she'd leaned on. The simplest human truth in all of this was that accountability is messy and painful. Justice does not, by design, make everyone feel safe. It makes truth audible, and truth often sits uneasily on family tables. That moment, those human faces, reminded me that beyond ledgers and indictments, there were people whose dignity had been damaged. When indictments were unsealed, they charged Christopher and certain corporate entities with counts that, according to filings, involved fraud, conspiracy, and misappropriation of funds. Prosecutors asked for custodial arrangements and for continued freezes. Christopher pleaded not guilty. The legal calendar stretched out in a way that only legal calendars do. Indictments solve nothing overnight. They set in motion a formal battle across a landscape of motions, discovery, and ultimately trial. But even while the legal storm raged, restoration began in small, bureaucratic ways that felt deeply satisfying. With the court's approval, certain fiduciary mechanisms were put into place. Trustees were compelled to provide access to true records, previously hidden LLCs were compelled to disclose beneficiaries, and some of the properties held in corporate names were temporarily reassigned to a court-appointed custodian to prevent sale during litigation. Those bureaucratic instruments had the blunt power to undo, at least temporarily, the shifts that had erased my legal standing. The trust that had been described as for my benefit in old documents was by court order reviewed for activation. What activation means is prosaic. Trustees must account, produce ledgers, and if the court finds that the trust had been undermined, it can order that the beneficial interest be honored. When the judge signed an order recognizing the credible possibility that the trust had been improperly altered, that recognition felt like a small victory. It validated the meticulous work I and others had done. During the months that followed, stubborn, small things happened that mattered more than headlines. Banks unspooled certain transfers for forensic review. A mortgage that had been shifted was re-examined and retitled in a way pending the court's ultimate determination. The hospice charity that Christopher had used for a public-facing portfolio suddenly had to provide audited statements. The effect was cumulative. Each small legal reversal strained the web of accounts that had been constructed to mask beneficiaries. The public reaction continued to be messy. Christopher's PR still pushed sympathetic pieces, and there were late-night commentators who suggested I was opportunistic. But there were also op-eds that asked uncomfortable questions about guardianship, about how families with money are sometimes shielded from scrutiny, and about the importance of institutional checks on private wealth. A few journalists did deep-dive pieces showing how shell companies function in estate redirections. Their stories offered a type of cultural accountability that complemented the legal one. The human costs, for me, included things I did not expect. My professional life suffered. Even after internal reviews cleared me of wrongdoing, recruitment calls slowed for a while. Friends became more cautious. There were therapy bills and nights when I replayed the shove and the smell of pine and bay rum and wondered whether I had chosen the right path. But those were costs I accepted, because the alternative, walking away and letting the ledger stand, felt like complicity. There were vindications too, quieter than headlines, but no less meaningful. Jennifer was offered a paid position in the nonprofit entity we would found months later. Dorothy, after cooperating with the prosecution, negotiated a settlement that allowed her to speak out without crippling legal consequences. She later became an advocate for paralegals who find themselves boxed into ethical compromises. Grandma Etta, who never wanted to be in the spotlight, sat down for an interview with Chad and spoke plainly about signatures and memory. After her testimony, several previously reticent relatives started to ask questions, the way one opens a window in a room that seemed suddenly stuffy. The trial phase, when it arrived, was not a single cinematic day, but a long series of hearings. Witnesses testified, records were subpoenaed, and the defense tried to suggest reasonable alternative explanations for the transfers. In the crosswalk between law and narrative, sometimes what wins is not the perfect story, but the weight of documentation. Our pile of receipts, chain of custody statements, notarized recollections, and forensic charts make judges and juries do the slow arithmetic of truth. Months later, a jury returned findings that matched the path we'd laid out, a pattern of transfers inconsistent with stated intentions and obstruction in certain reporting channels. Christopher was convicted on multiple counts, according to court records. The conviction didn't feel like vindication in a gloating sense. It felt like legal closure. There is a strange, sober gravity to seeing a judge read a verdict. Justice in a courtroom is procedural and measured, not theatrical. After the verdict, the court ordered certain restitution and a final accounting of the assets that had been reallocated. That accounting allowed the trust to be restored, pending the equitable distribution the court would ultimately order. Legal outcomes come with a bunch of caveats and hedges, appeals, motions for new trials, insistence on procedural errors, but the practical consequence for my life was clear. The trust that had been constructed in my name was acknowledged as real, the assets that had been misdirected were identified, and the freezing orders had prevented further dissipation. In shorthand, what had been hidden started to come back into the light. And once the ledger was corrected, we could start to think about what to do with what remained. Restoration for me was never about vengeance. I didn't want to stand on a pile of seized watches and declare victory.
My grandmother's simple, stubborn ethic guided me. Make wrongs right insofar as possible, and then try to stop them from happening to someone else. That's how the nonprofit idea was born. We used a portion of the recovered assets to establish a foundation for wards and beneficiaries, an organization designed to provide legal assistance and forensic accounting support to people who are dependent on guardians or trustees. The nonprofit's first program was a small legal scholarship and emergency legal fund. We hired Jennifer to run case intake and Dorothy to manage ethical training for paralegals and legal assistants. Chad's documentary, which had followed the arc of the investigation without sensationalizing it, raised both awareness and donations. Unexpectedly, the public empathy translated into financial support. The Foundation's practice was to offer pro bono counsel for those who had been quietly shuffled aside in the name of family generosity. There were complicated family reckonings, too. My mother took time. She oscillated between anger at Christopher and grief for what she'd lost of her own life, comfort, routine, dignity. We had conversations that edged toward reconciliation, but they were slow and often circuitous. Trust takes longer than court orders. Brittany's relationship to the family fractured. She accepted a plea arrangement that included restitution and community work. She later approached me, hesitantly, apologized in a way that recognized how her life had been scaffolded, and asked whether I would help her find legitimate employment. I said yes, because accountability can be restorative if it opens the possibility of repair. I visited Christopher once after his conviction, in a visiting room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and last semester's regret. He did not look like the powerful man who'd presided over boardrooms and charity balls. He looked thin and small. I did not gloat. I brought with me a small, grainy photograph, the same one with the timestamp that had begun this whole thing, and set it on the visiting room table. I told him simply that the photograph had mattered because it was timestamped. Truth, I said, has weight. He said he had been trying to protect the family legacy. I listened. The man who'd once shoved me at a table and laughed did not offer a straight apology. What he did offer, finally, was a quiet admission that things had been done in ways that were necessary, and that in his calculus the ends had justified the shifts. I did not accept the moral calculus. I accepted, in the way you accept broken furniture, the reality that things could be repaired only partly and at a cost. The foundation we established grew slowly but with surprising momentum. We partnered with banks, with legal aid societies, and with a coalition of elder care advocates who had long been frustrated by how guardianship and trusteeship can be used to obscure exploitation. Our mission was narrow and pragmatic: legal help, forensic accounting, and a small emergency fund to prevent immediate dissipation of assets while a legal strategy could be assembled. That practical approach resonated with people who had seen similar patterns: adult children who suddenly found themselves excluded from caregiving decisions, heirs who discovered assets had vanished through a maze of LLCs and owed obligations that were never met. There were public-facing pieces we insisted on:
transparency in how the nonprofit was run, independent audits, and oversight by a board that included survivors of similar betrayals. We wanted to be the model we had once needed: plain language, accessible help, and the kind of dull, steady paperwork no one wants to do until they need it. The first scholarship we funded was named for Grandma Etta. She declined any ceremony, but accepted quietly when I said the award would be for students studying law, public policy, and accounting, fields that make it harder for predators to hide behind firms and charities. The years that followed were not a tidy tale of triumph. There were appeals that dragged on. Christopher's lawyers fought to unfreeze certain properties. Some assets had already been dissipated beyond recovery. I paid therapists and accountants and learned to sleep without the binder beside the bed. But the small, everyday restorations mattered. The trustee finally authorized funds for my college tuition. The family business was restructured with new fiduciary oversight. Community programs that had been stripped of funds received reparations where possible. A curious effect of the whole ordeal was how it changed my relationship with public narrative. I still have a caution about social media. It tends to chew nuance for breakfast. But I also accept that stories, when reported responsibly, can catalyze accountability. Chad's documentary and a few careful investigative pieces created a public attentiveness that slowed the PR machine long enough for the legal system to move. That is not always the case. Sometimes the internet amplifies the wrong parts of a story. In this instance, it created a pressure valve that allowed institutions with subpoena power to act. 15 years after my parents left, when the legal paperwork finally read trust restored pending equitable distribution, when accounts that had been hidden were disclosed, and when the frosting on the dining room table no longer had to serve as the evidence of a family's willingness to ignore harms, I felt a kind of exhausted relief. The freeze in that headline had begun as an ugly, unexpected word. It became, by legal design, a tool to stop further harm. Having it applied to my parents' accounts was painful because it exposed their lives to scrutiny, but their accounts were linked to transfers that mattered to the case. The freeze was a way to prevent further dissipation while truth clarified.
Years later, in the quiet of an afternoon where the house smells like lemon and the clock ticks with the indifferent patience of time, I think about what came after the verdict more than about the verdict itself. Restoration is not 19 bullet points checked off a list. It's the slow creation of new structures that prevent the same thing from happening again. It's Grandma Etta teaching other elders to notarize and to keep copies. It's Jennifer teaching young paralegals how to refuse to be complicit. It's the nonprofit fielding calls from people who say, "I have a stack of receipts and a suspicion," and offering them a path that doesn't ask them to be brave in isolation. Sometimes I am asked, in interviews or at panels, whether I feel vindicated. I tell them the truth. Vindication is not a tidy, joy-filled trophy. It is a mixture of relief and sorrow. It is seeing a document retitled correctly and thinking of the kid who owned the night before the shove. It is realizing that the people who are loudest in defense of privilege will keep defending it, but that systems can be made a little harder to exploit. I also tell them the simple thing my grandmother taught me. Memory matters. Keep records. Not because records are dramatic, but because they make intransigent facts impossible to fully erase. The binder I stapled together in tremulous hands 13 years into my adult life was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of stewardship. You steward what matters, and sometimes that means you steward your own dignity. The final scene of my story is small and oddly domestic. I go back to the house that once felt like a stage for roles I was forced to play. The dining table is different now, renovated under the watch of a trustee, and used for meetings about the nonprofit rather than silent rituals of gratitude. I sit at the head of it once, and for a moment I think about the shove. Then I push the chair aside and place a small framed photograph on the table, the same time-stamped photo that started the cascade. I do not need to relive humiliation. I need to mark a place where reckoning happened. Christopher is serving a sentence, as court records show. Brittany works a job that allows her to be accountable in a public way and to make restitution over time. My mother lives quieter now, often coming to board meetings for the foundation to read minutes, to proofread grant applications, to knit quietly in the corner. Grandma Etta passed on what mattered: the names of notaries, the dates, a ledger in a closet. Grandma Etta's ledger is now photo-documented and housed in our nonprofit's archives. I tell people who listen that justice is not sweet. Justice is balance. It is a tedious reordering of facts that, if you are lucky and persistent, can tilt outcomes toward fairness. Justice is also non-glamorous. Paperwork, audits, affidavits, patient cross-examination, and institutional pressure. It is the work of many people who do not make the risible headlines.
It was Jennifer's spreadsheets, Dorothy's recording, Mitchell's legal drafts, Agent Chen's subpoenas, Chad's documentary framing, and my grandmother's memory that together moved the machine. So if you remember one thing from this story,
Let it be that the smallest actions can have the largest ripples. A USB slid under a tablecloth, a binder built slowly on a counter, a phone call taken at 3:12 a.m., one careful affidavit. That slow accumulation of boring facts is the architecture of accountability. That shove at the table did not define where my life ended. It defined where my life began to look for what was missing. If this story has mattered to you, consider subscribing and following the Foundation's page. There are resources linked in the description to help people who suspect financial exploitation or who need pro bono legal assistance. Share this with someone who needs to know that the quiet work of documentation can change outcomes, and that there are people out there who will stand with you if you prove the pattern. Justice, I have learned, is less about spectacle and more about making the ledger right. It's about restoring dignity to places where it was misallocated, and building systems so the shove at the table becomes harder to perform. If we can do that, then what started with humiliation ends with something far quieter and more powerful: restoration.